Howdy, Crumb Bums! It's time for another episode of Canonically Crumb, the only show that explores the comics and characters of the Crummy-verse. In 1968, Don Donahue traded his $300 hi-fi tape player to publish the first ever underground comics book, R.Crumb's Zap Comix #1. It was printed on a multi-lith 1250, a small offset printing press, and was hand-stapled. Robert and his then-wife Dana sold copies out of a pram on Haight-Ashbury for 25 cents each. In 2011, a near-mint first edition copy sold at auction for over $20,000. By issue 4, Crumb had been joined by fellow cartoonists Gilbert Shelton, S. Clay Wilson, and Spain Rodriguez, as well as painter Robert Williams and psychedelic poster artist Victor Moscoso and Rick Griffin. This would be the Zap roster for the next 30 years. To finance Zap, these 7 samurai of underground comics would create a series of collaborative jam pages for each issue and auction off the originals. This format would continue, as yearly as possible, until 1998. Which is the topic of today's episode. The Zap Files, Rashomon, and Terry Zigoff's. As always, we need to acknowledge that, for our purposes, R.Crumb's canon includes the Big Yum Yum book, the Complete Crumb, the Weirdo Years, Zap, Hup, Mystic Funnies, and a bit of Dirty Laundry. As well today, we'll be using the 2002 Gary Groth interview with Victor Moscoso from the Comics Journal number 246 and the Mythology of S. Clay Wilson Volume 3 by Patrick Rosenkrantz as non-canonical sources.
そうだ。あの金さえ吹かなければあの男も俺に殺されずに済んだもの。
Zap number 14 was published by Last Gasp in 1998. It was the first issue to feature Zap newcomer Paul Mavrides. What led to his induction was an incident between Crumb and other Zap alumni, which is somewhat pettily exposed in this very issue. Our first glimpse of the incident appears on the wraparound cover by S. Clay Wilson. The details of this cover mostly reference Wilson's contributions inside of the issue, namely a trilogy of sleazy post-apocalyptic comics set in rotting Zombiesville. They feature Star-Eyed Stella, Ruby the and the infamous Checkered Demon. But there's more going on here. For one, there's a prominent nude figure of Wilson's then-girlfriend, Rebecca G. Wilson, no relation, who he actually thanks by name. Rebecca is a writer, photographer, and now the girlfriend of Dave Davies from the Kinks. You'll find her Twitter in the show description. But the incident that we're here to talk about today appears in Rebecca's left hand. There we find the demonic apparitions of R.Crumb and Victor Moscoso locked in an eternal struggle. Moscoso, with his fiery red eyes, strikes Crumb in the arm while they both gnash at an issue of Zap Comix with their teeth. Rebecca's skull bracelet, a sort of memento mori, draws the eye down to the Apex Novelty logo, the original publisher of Zap Comix, which is in low relief on a monolithic slab. It's engraved with the words, "Underground Cartoonist Entrance." Wilson's cover art, with its ecstatic violence, sex, death, and sublime destruction, acts as a warning to readers that Zap Comix is in a state of chaos. Perhaps this is even the end of Zap and underground comics altogether. So what the hell happened here? Crumb's sole contribution to Zap 14 is a 2-page autobiographical strip called I've Had It, which is dated 1996. In the narration, Crumb, oddly addressing himself in the second person, says that when you were younger, you created Zap in the underground comics movement, but now you're middle-aged and deserve to just live out your fantasies. Which is how we find him, in Terry Zigoff's basement, indulging once again his idiosyncratic leg perversions. He muses to himself, "That documentary film about me claims to tell the shocking real story. They should only know." The critically acclaimed documentary Crumb, directed by Zwigoff, was released a year prior to this comic being made. Robert was already living in France, and it's possible that he was in America staying at Terry's place in order to promote the film at the time. As things are getting creative, there's a knock at the door. It's Terry's wife, Missy Axelrod. She tells Robert that his friends are here, S. Clay Wilson, Victor Moscoso, and that guy, Spain. Irritated, he tells her that they should wait for him in the kitchen. Back in the room, he tells his paramour that these artists want him to attend the Zap Jam despite his desire to quit, a sentiment which he's perhaps not expressed strongly enough, and they're here to bully him into it. He compares the situation to trying to quit the mafia. The woman, who I'm pretty sure is Carol Vinson, tells him that if he goes, she won't be there when he gets back. And so Crumb resolves to quit Zap once and for all. Carol adds that she never wants Crumb to put her in one of his funny books, which he hilariously promises never to do. Also, there's a copy of Seth Speaks on the floor, which is a book from 1973, supposedly dictated by a metaphysical being. Upstairs, Crumb readies himself for the big showdown. Spain asks, "You ready to rock and roll, man?" Crumb meekly resists, saying, "I can't do it anymore." Moscoso and Spain, the Zap ideologues, respond by saying that Zap is still the best comic going, and we kick all their asses, man, while S. Clay Wilson just belches. Crumb tries to be more assertive, but Victor objects, saying, "You too big for us now, or what, Mr. Movie Star?" And Victor assaults Crumb, if you can call it that, smacking him on the arm and shouting, "Where's your loyalty? If I was in your position, I'd draw for you, putz." While in the background, Wilson slurps his tree frog beer, which was a recurring joke brand amongst the Zap crew. On the way out the door, Moscoso gets in one more dig, calling Crumb a jerk. While that jerk ponders, well, that's that, I guess. Speaking directly to the reader, Crumb gives out about Zap. He says comics are a medium for the young, and there's a hot new generation that's blowing the old guys off the stage. He says, "Look at us. We're just a bunch of characters out of a Dan Clowes comic." Dan Clowes, of course, is a renowned creator of the comic book 8-Ball, from the pages of which Ghost World would become a feature film also directed by Terry Zigoff just a few years later. It's at this point when you realize why this particular Crumb comic looks a little off. It's because he added a few subtle Clowesian flourishes. 8-Ball comics often begin with a simple bold font, and end with a character addressing the reader. Even Crumb's use of light and shadow, as well as his framing, appears to be aping Clowes, and the lettering he's using in the narration is clearly an homage. Although this comic is exceedingly petty, Crumb's self-deprecation and keen sense of humor really do manage to make it work somehow. He preemptively disarms his critics by portraying himself as a total narcissist with an inflated ego, who has no regard for friendships or any basic common courtesy. I especially like the line, "Friends? What friends?" And yet he also portrays himself as having trouble saying no to anyone. Meanwhile, his depiction of Wilson, Moscoso, and Spain make them into geriatric anachronisms just bumbling around Terry Zigoff's kitchen. It's simple but biting satire. And of course he ends with a message of passing the generational torch, which is always a popular sentiment. So even though he's acting like a petulant child here, he doesn't really come across all that bad. So how did the rest of the Zap gang respond to this comic?
妻を手ごめにするとそこに腰を下ろしたままいろいろ妻を慰め出した。 妻は当然と笹の落ち葉に座ったなりじっと膝へ目をやっている。
As it turns out, Spain and Moscoso just couldn't let it go. So on the very next page, also dated 1996, we get Zap Confidential, Incident at Terry Zigoff's. Academic title, Hypersensitive Cartoonists Rend Their Garments Over Minor Bullshit. It seems Klaus is once again being invoked, this time in the form of his excellent 8-ball strip, Art School Confidential, which would become yet another Zwigoff film. We find Spain, Moscoso, and Wilson, world-famous Zap cartoonists, in the underground Zap bunker. They've received Crumb's submission, which we've just read, and he's threatening to print it elsewhere if they don't print it in Zap. Cut to this schoolboy image of Crumb, which is a reference to Crumb's submission from the previous issue, as well as what a man-child he's acting like here. A rib that perhaps would work better if Crumb hadn't already drawn himself this way. He's flanked on either side by jackbooted, well, Nazis basically. One has a Z on his armband, which I suppose stands for Zwigoff. The narration reads, Crumbelina's really going off the deep end this time. He's really sucked in his own propaganda. And Crumb thinks to himself, Jeepers, I'm so helpless. Next we see the young Crumb, still under guard, drawing Susie Bright in the nude. Oh, that trash man. The caption cringily reads that Crumb enjoyed himself at the previous jam where Susie so generously revealed her fine self, and young Crumb is thinking, oh boy, she left her boots on. Feminist writer Susie Bright, also known as Susie Sexpert, was a friend of Spain and had invited herself to the previous jam for Zap number 13. She became a somewhat controversial figure after S. Clay Wilson kicked her out of his house for getting nude while reading comic books. She had a fantasy of becoming an artist's muse, which apparently she was successful at, appearing in the Zap universe as a sort of recurring meme. According to the Moscoso interview, Crumb specifically requested that she leave her cowboy boots on. Spain then sets about setting the record straight on Crumb's statement that he started the underground comics movement with Zap number 1. Spain points out that both he and Kim Deitch, who were roommates in the late 60s, had been doing comics for the East Village Other before they ever even heard of Crumb, and Bill Beckman, Trina Robbins, and Nancy Panazika preceded even them. Here's a depiction of that time from Kim Deitch's collection, Reincarnation Stories, from 2019. A note at the bottom of the panel says he's just setting the record straight. You know, dispassionately, for posterity. But the fact that he's dedicated a whole panel to this shows that he's clearly bothered by Crumb's statement. Now we get to their version of events. It's all very reasonable. Earlier in the week, Spain asked Crumb if it was alright to call him up on the jam night to see if he was up for it, which Crumb tepidly agreed to. After calling multiple times and, according to the Moscoso interview, apparently leaving several messages, they figured Crumb must know they're coming to pick him up. But it seems more like Crumb was ready for them. Spain points out that Williams was also in town and that this was a rare opportunity. But Crumb, barely acknowledging him, says he's not interested and simply doesn't have time. Victor loses his patience, shouting, Crumb, you lonely bastard, where's your loyalty? If I was in your position, I'd draw with us. You, Mr. Famous Movie Star, and he smucks Crumb on the arm. Then we see Crumb depicted as Christ, fidgeting with his crown of thorns, saying, Victor, you unraveled the crown. Victor, with a clenched fist, thinks to himself, shit, you let him get to you. He could have called last night and avoided all of this. Cut back to the Zap underground bunker for some real talk. Wilson, who apparently wished to stay out of the whole affair, sips a beer with a parrot on his shoulder, a reference to his character, Captain Pissgums. Victor says that it's not about whether Zap is still relevant, it's about 20 years of friendship and respect, and Spain says he'd gladly take credit for bullying Crumb into a masterpiece like Cave Wimp, which actually is one of Crumb's best comics, and definitely the subject of a future episode. Finally, we see the three leaving Terry Zigoff's place, and they sum up their position. I thought we was all pals, and bastard set us up to drive over so he could tell us to f*** off. And they sign it, Moscoso and that guy, Spain. Although they had every right to respond given Crumb's ultimatum, somehow Spain and Wilson come across as even more petty than Crumb here. Well, the strip's academic title, hypersensitive cartoonists rend garments over minor bullshit may be accurate, it's twice levied back at them. Their cheeky self-aggrandizement maybe worked a little better as early 30-somethings than it does as late 50-somethings. Feels more like they're just flattering themselves rather than joking. Look at how much younger they depict themselves here than in Crumb's comic. It really highlights the difference between how they see themselves and how Crumb sees them. Moscoso has called the Zap Gang the Rolling Stones of underground comics. But the thing is, you really want to be the Rolling Stones of the early 70s, not the Rolling Stones of the late 90s. Still, they are responding sincerely as friends would, so there is some genuine emotion in this comic, which I do appreciate. But what really went down at Old Man Zwigoff's? If only there was an objective third party who could tell us.
日の丸は女の前に両手をついて謝っていた。
俺はこれまで悪念に悩まされるとその悪念の命ずるままにしてきた男だ。それが一番苦しまない方法だと信じてきた。
Paul Mavrides, a decade younger than the rest of the Zap crew, had been established in the underground comic scene since the 1970s, having appeared in such venerable comics as Young Lust and American Splendor, to name a few. Also, he was a founding member of the Church of the Subgenius, the tongue-in-cheek postmodern cult headed by the enigmatic Reverend Bob Dobbs, of which Crumb was also a member. Paul's version of events starts with a very Clausian title card, which is dated 2 years later than the other two, in 1998, so it seems this issue was 2 or 3 years in the making. Although it's titled My Big Break, referring to his initiation into Zap Comix, he admits it's a little bit like being invited to the party 20 years after the beer is gone. He also promises to tell us what really went down. Oh boy, finally! We find Ol R watching a very controversial episode of the Teletubbies when there's a knock at the door. It's the Zap Gang, and they want Crumb to put on his drawing shoes and kick out the Zap Jam. But Crumb wants to pass, and he trails off saying, "Guess should done this," apparently realizing he could easily have made this clear before things reached this point. A rather joker-fied looking Moscoso becomes incensed, shouting, "You too famous for us now?" And while Wilson is being psychologically scarred by the Teletubbies, in silhouette Moscoso adds, "You know the jam will be unsellable without your scribbles." There's certainly some truth to this. Only a couple years later, Crumb's placemat doodles would be selling in New York galleries for thousands of dollars. So yeah, his inclusion would drive up the price and demand. Then Moscoso mentions the Grand Canyon that Crumb's absence has opened up in the issue. His 2 pages in number 14 is a significant reduction from his 10 pages in number 13. Crumb suggests getting Mavrides to fill in, adding he loves cleanup duty behind the 60s elephant, referring to Mavrides' longtime collaboration with fellow Zap member Gilbert Shelton on the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. Moscoso hilariously replies, "Mavrides and Zap? I'd sooner cut off his hand." Spain then threatens Crumb, saying, "Just remember what happened to Rick when he tried to quit." This is both a reference to Crumb's statement that quitting Zap is like quitting the Mafia, but also a darkly funny joke about Rick Griffin's tragic death in a motorcycle accident only a few years prior. It's also apparent at this point that Mavrides is drawing them in a way that's evocative of each artist's own style, such as Moscoso's metallic-looking nib marks, or Spain's signature bold contour lines of the hair. Crumb stands his ground, saying, "The kids don't give a damn about Zap, let it go!" And what's the deal with this pose? It's got to be a reference to something, but I don't know what. It reminds me a bit of the 3 Wise Monkeys, but I don't think that's it. If you know what this is referring to, please let me know in the comments. As Crumb walks away laughing, "Ha ha ha, foolish artists!" Moscoso stabs him in the back of the head with the rapidograph. I use this kind, by the way. And he stands over Crumb's dead body, exclaiming, "Hi yourself, Mr. movie star." And in the background there's a poster for the Crumb documentary. Of course, every Crumb bum probably realizes that these last 3 panels are a faithful recreation of the death of Fritz the Cat from 1972. It's apropos, as the full title of that comic is Fritz the Cat, Superstar. And it's all about how his movie fame turns Fritz into a raging egomaniac asshole that treats people like garbage. Which ultimately gets him murdered by his neurotic, abused ex-girlfriend Andrea Ostrich when she stabs him in the head with an ice pick and stands over his corpse laughing, "Hi yourself, smartass!" with the caption, "Violence in the Media." We'll cover the life and death of Fritz the Cat in many future episodes, but essentially Crumb killed off Fritz in the comics because he hated Ralph Bakshi's 1972 movie version. Interestingly, in the R.Crumb handbook, Crumb recalls, "Victor Moscoso was the only one who warned me. If you don't stop this film from being made, you are going to regret it for the rest of your life." And he was right. Mavrides signs off with, "Well, that's the way I heard it." And perhaps problematically, he includes Rodney King's famous appeal to LA rioters, "Can't we all just get along?" This is the best one. It's very funny, it takes the piss out of the incident, and also the self-seriousness of the whole Zap gang. At the same time, it sheds some light on aspects of the story that both the primary sources left out. Mavrides is definitely a welcomed addition to the Zap roster. In the R.Crumb coffee table art book, Crumb says of the Zap crew that they were already viewed as the establishment by 1973, and he was losing interest even then. At the time, Crumb wanted to publish Zap more regularly and open it up to more artists, but the idea was resisted, especially by Moscoso and Wilson. So by 1996, there must have been quite a bit of resentment built up. It's also notable that the next two arguably most famous and successful Zap members, Williams and Shelton, don't really weigh in on the incident, which I think paints a picture of apathy on their part at best. It really seems like Moscoso and Spain were the only remaining true believers in Zap at this point. Even Wilson stayed out of it. And the fact that you could still buy a first printing of this issue on LAST GASP's website nearly 25 years later suggests that maybe Crumb was right about Zap's relevance. The bottom line is, if Crumb didn't want to go play with his friends, he should have asserted himself more. Like, pick up a phone, asshole, am I right? But, at the same time, maybe Moscoso and Spain could have got the hint too. And, obviously, you shouldn't hit people. But you especially shouldn't hit wimps. And Victor Moscoso sums this up really well, actually, in this quote here. "Come on. What kind of chicken shit guy is Victor Moscoso that he beats up on a wimp like R.Crumb? That's chicken shit. What I should have done is said, 'Okay, bye,' and walked away." And apparently he also apologized before Crumb even submitted his comics, so they're all just acting like a bunch of babies about this whole thing. What else can you say? There's a lot of emotion there, but clearly they are all friends, and sometimes friends just aren't the best to each other. Ultimately, there have been 2 more issues released since Zap number 14, both featuring significant contributions from Robert. And he even attended the next jam session, so it's all water under the bridge, I guess. Sadly, Spain Rodriguez died of cancer in 2012, and S. Clay Wilson suffered a brain injury in 2008 that eventually ended his ability to draw and even communicate. He died last year in 2021. While Zap number 16 featured unfinished and compromised work from both artists, as well as an unpublished sketch by Rick Griffin, it seems unlikely that there will be any more Zap issues in the future. But who knows? Well, Crumb Bums, it's time to say sayonara to another episode of Canonically Crumb. If you enjoy this program, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, be a ding-dong daddy, and ding that bell. I'm your host, Kyle Bridgett. You can find my links in the show description and join me in the Nostral Zone, where we listen to tunes and draw cartoons every Sunday from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Central Time. And if you want to support this program and myself, you'll find my Patreon in the show description as well. Canonically Crumb will be back as weekly as possible with another deep dive into the Crummy-verse. Thanks again, Crumb Bums, and keep on doofing?